speaking from Huddersfield, Yorkshire, where we do have some of our own stranded colourwork gloves. I thought I'd just pop this image in. It's what we all need to knit gloves or anything else: wool and double-pointed needles. I like circulars actually, and then all those other little bits we need as well. So the next slide will tell you a bit about me. I just wanted to put myself in context really, and to explain where this glove obsession came from. I first saw a pair of colour pattern gloves in the early 1980s, and then I'd never seen anything like them. And then I made notes on them and I remembered them, and never knitted anymore until I got to the end of my PhD. There's quite a lot in my career that's not in quite the right order. So I did my PhD right at the end. And I rather wished I'd done it on knitted gloves, but I didn't. It was about sustainability and Welsh textiles. Having finished my PhD, I retired and I started volunteering at the collection of the Knitting and Crochet Guild, and I shall show some pieces from that collection during my presentation. During that time, in the last 10 years or so more, I've been knitting gloves, researching them, designing them, and eventually exhibiting them as well, and traveling to places to look at them and to enjoy them, and ultimately publishing my book, which is more or less 2 years old to the day, in February 2025. So in the next slide, liturgical gloves are they are a subject on their own. And I put this slide in because it suddenly occurred to me that they are probably the earliest stranded colourwork we know. Knitting is not that old as a technique. So if you read anything about it going back to ancient times, it's wrong. These gloves date from about the 15th century. They belong to a bishop. They are in a cathedral in the south of France, in the foothills of the Pyrenees. And if you look at the cuff of the one on the right, you'll see that it's curled slightly back and there is stranded knitting there, and it's silk and a silk core and gold thread, and that is definitely a stranded technique. So I'm going to move swiftly on. Where are we finding stranded colourwork gloves now? Well, sorry, not where are they, but what are they like? They're mostly knitted by hand. You can knit them on the machine. I've done it. It needs work. They're not great. Often now they're knitted in wool or wool mixes. Those first ones were silk, and you can still knit them in silk. A lot are just two colours, and that is very striking. In the UK, and they are all two-colour gloves, ours in the UK. But there are other examples as well, and we'll have a look at them later. But when you get to the Baltic countries, to Latvia and Estonia, they can be multicoloured. They can have many colours in the cuffs, and sometimes more than two colours in the hands as well. They often have the initials and date knitted into them. And I had put UK only, but in actual fact, there's an example from somewhere else that also has the initials and date knitted in. And I think that's significant because it indicates how special they were to the owner and to the maker, and how special they still can be. They're very often finely knitted, 90 stitches, sometimes more, round the cuff. And they're obviously knitted in the round in a stranded technique. So that's what they're like. I will be straying a little and showing some examples using other colourwork techniques just because they look so fabulous. And then if we go on to look at where these gloves are found, well, I actually live in the county where we have a particular tradition, and then going around northwards into Scotland, up to Fair Isle, which is between Scotland and Shetland, across the sea to Norway. I am going to show a pair from Sweden just because it's next door to Norway. And then around the Baltic into the three small countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, I haven't got any from Poland and Germany, but that's really because I've never been or found any in books there. But I have got some from Denmark and some from the Netherlands. And then, not on the map, but not to be forgotten, they're found in Canada, Labrador, and Newfoundland, and also in the northern states. In Maine, there's a pattern glove and mitten tradition knitting there too. Okay, so in the UK, here we are. This is a map from my book, and I'm probably somewhere round about the D of Yorkshire Dales in Huddersfield. But the gloves were knitted in the countryside to the north of Yorkshire, in the national park called the Yorkshire Dales. It was a poor area, an upland area, so it had a poor climate, lots of sheep. And what do? You knit things to keep you warm, and if you're poor, you knit them to sell them for money as well, if you can. And there was so much knitting that the village of Dent the knitters became known as the terrible knitters of Dent. Terrible in the sense of they did it all the time, rather than terrible, bad. And then Hawes is marked on this map because it was the location in the knitting industry, but there's a terrific museum there, and we'll have a look at some pictures of what they have in a few moments. And Grasmere, which is in the Lake District, has a little collection of pattern knitted gloves. In the Wordsworth Museum, which is a funny thing because obviously it's a literature archive, but these gloves were deposited there, I think, really because probably many years ago, people realized they were precious, but didn't know quite what to do with them, and they ended up in Grasmere. And then up on to the north, we've got the little town of Sanker, which is home to the famous pattern gloves there. Okay, so let's have a look at some Dales gloves. And here they are. They have several names, which is a little confusing. So Yorkshire Dales, Dent, which is the village where many of them, I believe, were knitted by a woman called Mary Allen. Now, we have documentation that her mother knitted gloves too, and they were both named as glove knitters in the census. And as you can see, this pair are from the collection of the Knitting and Crochet Guild. They're very slim. They're probably not worn. They have a diamond pattern up the back, which is one of the characteristic patterns, but they are also found with a zigzag pattern and with a little tree of life pattern in columns on the back of the hand. There's a long and complicated story of how they got into the collection of the Knitting and Crochet Guild. But I do want to say at this point that I firmly believe this pattern of glove is very rare. I've found about 20 pairs in museums in the UK, and I don't believe there are any outside. But if any of you know of any anywhere that look the same or similar to this, then I'd be delighted to hear from you. Okay, the next slide shows you the little village of Dent, very, very typical rural village, small cottages, the whole place absolutely buzzed with knitting, not generally, about 2 centuries ago, not generally of gloves, of coarse stockings and jumpers, sweaters, that were then sold to make money, because the people were poor, and they would farm, they would knit. If there was a demand for stockings, if there was a war on, there would be a demand, and they would mine as well, depending on all the various prices to be had for those activities. And then this on the right, you can see some more Dales gloves. These were knitted by Mary Allen. We have that documented, and they're in the museum in Hawes. And you can see a knitting stick, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in the next slide, and a curved needle, which is what they were that they knitted with. So in the next slide, we see, this is a display case I put together for an exhibition some while ago, actually. But I want to talk a little about the book it's the same, 2 editions of the same book. The one in the top left-hand corner, which is The Old Hand Knitters of the Yorkshire Dales. And it was written by 2 redoubtable women called Mary Hartley and Joan Ingleby. And they took it upon themselves. It was very much their mission in life to document rural life in Yorkshire, and they travelled around. They had a car. They had means, so they could do this, and they documented most aspects of rural life. But in particular, they documented the knitting, and in the 50s, and they gathered information and memories from older members of the community, and they took photographs and they drew. And I believe firmly that without their documentation, we might never have known that these gloves had been knitted in Yorkshire. And the key thing is that they also collected, and what they collected formed the basis of what is now in the Dales Countryside Museum. So we have the gloves that they came across. Not all of the ones mentioned in the books. Some of those have vanished. But they collected what they found and documented them. And they also collected knitting sticks. Now, the ones at the front of this picture are from the Knitting and Crochet Guild, but there are many in Hawes. And you have them, they're the same as a belt in Shetland. You have them on at your waist, pushed into a belt, and then you use them as a support for your double-pointed needle. And if you've got one of these supports on, then you can let go of your knitting, and you can go and chase the pig or the child or whatever has to be done, and your knitting will stay there. Okay, so moving on, still in the UK, we have Sanka gloves. Now, they are not to be confused with Yorkshire Dales ones. And this is a very, very standard pattern called the Duke. And I was told that it was called a Duke pattern because of the grid that was added to the small patterns after the Duke of Buccleuch, who is the local landowner around those parts of southern Scotland. He's a massive, massive landowner. After the Duke enclosed some fields, and the grid was added to the patterns. And in general, the Duke is the most common pattern that you will see, but there are others. And again, we have it here that these were, the pattern to knit them was written down and published by Peyton and Baldwin's, who I would imagine most of you knitters will be familiar with as both a producer of patterns and a producer of yarns, even today. But immediately post-war, well, 1954, this pattern was published. There was quite a vogue for documenting and using folk patterns as inspiration for knitwear. And there's a pair of Latvian mitts in this series as well. So as you can see, it says a traditional Scottish style. and by the way, if anybody wants a copy of this pattern free of charge, contact me, and via the Knitting Crochet Guild, it can be provided. So just to say, the pair on the left, that I didn't knit them, but I was lucky enough to be able to buy them. They are a vintage pair. Those colours are very 1930s, going on into the 50s, the yellow and brown. And they obviously didn't sell. They don't have an initial on them, but they are a beautiful pair. And the fingers are pleated. You can just see, if you look to the left-hand side of the fingers, the one pattern pleats in so that they lie nicely flat across the top of the hand. Okay, so looking at more Sanka gloves in the next slide. So there are variations here. Lots of different patterns, the sort of patterns that you can easily knit using two colours, and just they're very ingenious. They'll have little tiny repeats, 3 dark, 3 light, and then you do 2 rows of those and you do a little switch round and it makes a check. So they have lots of lovely names like Shepherd's Plaid and Midge and Flea. There's a pattern called Prince of Wales, which is supposed to date back to when the Prince of Wales visited Sanka. And again, these have been documented by various sources. A woman's magazine wrote them down and published them in the 50s. And the Scottish Women's Institute published them, which are the patterns on the right. And currently, May McCormick, who is a prominent knitter and teacher in Sanka, is documenting and publishing all the patterns, and they can be found online via an organisation called sankanits.com. So it's important that these are recorded so that we know what has happened and what has been. And it's interesting, I think, that the Sanka tradition is very active still, which is just great. So the next slide shows a few more examples of Sanka gloves and the fine, increasingly hard to find good yarn that's fine enough. There used to be a lovely 3-ply sock yarn that was just absolutely perfect, and that's in this slide. It's a Regia one, but it's stopped. And you can see a pair that are in progress, the orange and green. They're very fine, and some others. Now, I must just tell you, the red and grey pair in the bottom left are the ones that I was given in about 1982. So those are the ones that started the whole thing. Okay, so Sanka, you'll see a street scene of it in the next slide. And I've said it's nestled in the hills, which it is. A long distance footpath goes through the town. So it's surrounded by countryside. It's got lead mining in a little village, about 10 miles away. There are cattle all around and sheep. So if we go on to the back to the map of the UK, you can see that really they're not that far apart. If you Google map it, it's about 100 miles, I think. And I believe that the link between the pattern gloves in Yorkshire and in southern Scotland is that movement of people between the lead mines and the cattle trading. And in fact, I found only last week, I gave a talk in Yorkshire, and somebody told me that her husband's grandparents were involved in the movement of cattle between southern Scotland and Yorkshire. So it's absolutely fascinating. The lead miners travelled with their families. So whether or not it was women, children, or men who knitted, then not necessarily the actual knitting, but the knowledge of it. Maybe they'd seen a pair and they remembered them. So that knowledge was spread. That's a theory, and it can't be, sadly, can't be verified at all. Okay, so if we go on to look at the map again, we can see how where we find Colorwork gloves. So the next slide shows you a rather dear little pair from Fair Isle. In the next slide. Okay, thanks. These are from again from the collection, and these came into the collection from an archive that had collected from around Europe, and they had a little swing tag on them saying Fair Isle. They're children's. They're probably from the 50s. They're quite simple. They've got a peasant thumb, but they're rather nice. And so we're halfway now to Shetland. And if we go on to the next slide, we get to Shetland and also to Norway. And both these pairs of gloves have good provenance. The pair on the right were bought by me in Shetland in the 80s. And the pair on the left are from the collection. And again, they have reliable provenance as having been bought in Norway. And I think you have to admit that the similarity is fairly striking. I just think it's amazing. But then in Shetland, they always say that they're closer to Norway, closer to Oslo than they are to London. And especially when going by sea was the primary form of transport, then it would have been a completely natural link. So there we have Norway moving north and now moving next door to Norway, although I realise that hasn't always been the case. These I have slipped in rather naughtily because they are not technically stranded knitting, I don't think. And I don't know if you're familiar with bowhouse knitting. It's fairly well documented, but they are just so lovely. And this richness of colour and structure that you've got. It was an income generating scheme in Sweden and it was, the designs were made and then people knitted them and they were sold in upmarket shops all over Europe, really. And these gloves are part of a set of a hat and scarf. And also in the collection, we have a jumper and cardigan set in the same pattern. And so I thought, well, they're next door to Norway, so let's just pop them in. And another, just before I leave them, if you look, the cuffs are felted, teased probably, using something like a little dog brush just to bring up the nap on the wool and give a lovely, sophisticated finishing touch. Okay, so now we go to the Baltics, and these are just some of the very many hundreds of gloves that I've just been so delighted to see in Estonia when I've visited. I've been 4 times to attend what's called Estonian Craft Camp, which is exactly what it sounds like. And I've learnt from very, very skilled and knowledgeable and generous teachers there. So the ones on the left are from an island called Muhu, and their trademark, as you might gather, is this fluorescent pink, which is actually wool and not synthetic, and often teamed with orange, and they just pop. So fashionable in the 60s, orange and pink, but always looking contemporary and modern now. Those have got peasant thumbs, but lots and lots of gorgeous colour work and detail on. I think including some braids and so on. So lots going on there. And then the little group on the right-hand side, completely different, but undyed white yarn with texture and travelling stitches, and then some colour work around the cuffs and lots of braids and travelling stitches and so on to give the interest. And I just think they're beautiful. Okay, and some more gloves from Estonia, because I just couldn't resist putting more in. And the slide, the image on the left, you've got a variety of techniques there. There is some stranded colour work, but the second in with the diamond on the back of the palm, on the back of the hand, beg your pardon, that is inlay technique or rusamine, which is a different way of getting colour into your knitting. And the cuff is a sort of travelling rib that looks a little like an entrelac, but really the techniques that are used are many and various, and paired with lace and so on. I just think they're wonderful. If you're a knitter, which I'm thinking possibly most of you are, then it's just an oh my moment, I think. And then the pair on the right, knitted by two very expert knitters, the green pair from Cully Jacobson, whose company sells Estonian gloves and mittens and also does holidays, and Christy Josty on the right, who has written several important books about Estonian knitting, and one in particular about glove knitting, and another one due out, I think. So the green one on the left, when I saw that cuff, I thought, oh wow, a modern cuff, sideways, side short row knitting garter stitch. But that pattern is in some books from the end of the 19th century in all sorts of bold colours. So still looking modern and fresh. And the one on the right, so finely knitted, teeny weeny little stitches, probably knitted on point, possibly 1.25 or 1 millimeter, 5 needles, and pure wool. Okay, so off to Latvia now, which I visited to look at mittens. And lo and behold, I found gloves, which was great because I do try to concentrate on gloves, because otherwise everything just gets, it would all double or quadruple. So on the left, a display from a museum in Liepaja, which is the town where we spent most time in the south of Latvia. We spent some time in Riga and then went down to Liepaja. And you can see again the wealth of patterning and the complexity and skill of the techniques. And the little group, the three group on the right-hand side, the heavily decorated cuff with multiple colours and the lovely, lovely lace patterns going right up the fingers. And I just think it's the skill in that knitting is just absolutely wonderful. Okay, and just a few more from Latvia. And these are from a village called Rukava. And again, here, it's particularly known for these patterned gloves. They're not especially fine. They're possibly more like I would call it a double knitting, but you'd call it a worsted, I think. But they often got 3 colours in the hand, which is absolutely beastly, I think, compared to 2. 2 you can cope with, 3 goes to hell with me anyway. But the interesting thing that they've done is that they have published a beautiful book entitled in English and in dual language, so you have Latvian and English, The Patrimony of Rukava Gloves and Mittens. And so these are documented and recorded. And I just think that's so important. Okay, now moving round the North Sea and going I went to somewhere called Leeuwarden, which is the capital of Friesland, which has its own language. It's a separate province, a separate area in the northern Netherlands. I was going there for a knitting conference in Leiden, and I took an extra day and went up to Leeuwarden. I knew these gloves were in this collection. And on the left, I thought you'd like to see the table that I had in the study room, and it's one of the biggest, well, I would say a thrill. It's a great excitement to be able to go behind the scenes in a museum and to see how things are stored and to see what else they have. So you can see the gloves, and the red ones were a replica knitted by one of the curators. But in the bottom of the slide, you can see a teeny weeny little pair of orange mittens for a doll. They're doll's mittens. And they're there because they have the same cuff as the gloves. So not only do the gloves have this fabulous knitting, very fine, with these gorgeous stars and an initial and a date, but they have these wacky cuffs just made from lots and lots of strands of the wool and then sort of gathered up into these clumps. And I've searched, the curators have searched. I had a search in my embroidery and other craft books, and we can't find it documented anywhere at all. So again, any ideas, we'd be thrilled to hear about where that came from. So they are very interesting and very lovely, finely knitted, quite big. They would fit a man, but you know, how you're going to find out who it was and why they're there, goodness knows. Okay, so now I'm going to zip across the Atlantic to Labrador and Newfoundland. And some of you might know, you've seen the mitten books from Maine or Saltwater Mitts by Shirley Scott and her co-author. And this is an image that Shirley let me have. And you can see the similarities, you know, pattern knitted gloves have got across there, probably with Scottish migrants. That pattern, the little sort of circle on a seeded ground, there's a Sanka glove pattern very similar to that, and they sometimes call it a pheasant's eye. So that's and in their book they show the Sanka gloves, and they show a pair of Dale's gloves as well. So that's a far-flung link. And I'm now going to come back across the Atlantic, so easy, to Denmark, where the Herning Museum, which is in Jutland, has a little collection, half a dozen pairs tops of gloves and mittens. And this is another area that has a poor climate. It's cold, it's wet, there's sheep. There were poor people. They wanted to keep themselves warm and they wanted to make an income. And that's what they did. They knitted, and these knitted pattern gloves have survived in their textile museum. Now, I've only seen a photograph of them that I didn't have permission for. So this is an artist's impression. They're peasant thumb and just this very simple grid pattern, too light, too dark. They look black and white, but they might be cream and dark brown. I don't know. I think I might go and see them. 2 rows, too dark, too light, 2 rows of that, and then alternate it just all the way up the glove. And although it's, I was going to say it's a natural thing to knit, but it isn't. Squares are not that easy in knitting. Diamonds are easier. The knitting lies easier. But the next slide will show you a pair that are now in my possession. Well, they're actually in my freezer. And I bought these last April. They came, somebody on social media told me they'd come up on the website First Dibs. Now, First Dibs sells luxury things. It sells, if you wanted an original Corbusier chaise longue, then you might find it on First Dibs, or a length of French brocade or something like that. But these gloves are not in good condition. They're very much, I would say, peasant art. They're filthy dirty. They've got no provenance other than they went through an auction house in the UK in 2014, where they were billed as either Sanka gloves, but then possibly Dale's. And again, you can see they've got the date and initial, not round the cuff, but on the palm of the hand. And really, there's just so much work to be done on these. And who knows? There are imponderables there, the same as on the Dutch pair. But I can only assume they're UK, but they mightn't be. Anyway, they are wool. I established that with a volunteer who knows more about history than I do. And the final image is really draws together the things that connect these gloves. There's apparently a Russian saying that says, "Don't ask who caught the cold when you all sit in the same draft." Well, you've got cold climates and sheep. You need to keep yourself warm. You need income, and I believe that a lot of knitting has been done in those circumstances. But I think special pattern gloves, people know how valuable they are in a way. If they've got the initials and dates on, then that indicates that they were made for somebody. So they're bespoke. They might be a gift. They might be kept very specially because of those things. And that's why they've survived. The plain stuff went years ago, but they've traveled. You'd see them and you'd think, that's nice or unusual, and they've traveled with people as they've worked. And I wanted to just share this image, which came to me via Shirley Scott from Saltwater Mitts, which is of Jean Cocteau, who some of you might be familiar with. He has an entry on Wikipedia. He considered himself primarily a poet, but he hung out in 1930s Paris with Picasso and Man Ray and all sorts of very erudite and artistic people. And lo and behold, what is he wearing to have his photograph taken, looking so moody? But his very best pair of Colorwork gloves. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. What just a fabulous presentation. And I just want to give a big thank you for you giving this to us. And I hope everyone really enjoyed it. I think now is a great time to open the floor for Q&A questions. You can submit those on the bottom bar. It usually says Q&A. I know we already have a couple so far. So to get started, do you think the square border that was added was a political statement against the landowner or just an opportunity to have more stitches for better shaping and visual accuracy due to the history of the time?
Well, I don't know. It sounded as though it was a bit of a sort of dig, well, you've put fences round our field, so we're going to put fences round our knitting. But in actual fact, the Duke of Buccleuch was a great supporter of the knitting industry. And when he knew that they didn't have very many orders, he would order some. And there's 2 instances of him ordering 40 pairs at a time. I mean the Duke of Buccleuch, at the time, not the current one. He ordered them for when the Prince of Wales visited, so they could be given out as gifts and so on. So I'm not sure about that grid, but it is unusual in folk knitting.
Well, my Zoom flickered briefly and I've lost a lot of the past chat messages, but I did see one that requested, Maddie, that you put up the slide toward the end with some of the links and information again, so people had a chance to write that down. And while you're pulling that up, naturally, Angharad, we've had some people who are very interested in having the opportunity to request a copy of the Sankar hand knitting pattern. And so folks have wondered how they can get a hold of you. Is your email address here, gloveknitter@gmail.com, the best way to request that knitting pattern?
Yes, that's possible. And also via the collections link on the Knitting and Crochet Guild page. But let me quickly also just say one thing. If you do obtain that pattern, the instructions are for UK style 3-ply wool, which is hardly more than a lace weight, and on size 16 needles. That's old UK size, which I think is something like, it's either 1 millimeter or 1.25. Now, if you knit that pattern using those size of yarn and needles, they come out teeny weeny. I've got quite slim, long hands, and they're way too small for me. So I would knit that pattern with a lighter weight of sock wool, probably. I mean, once you're knitting that very geometric pattern, you haven't got any wriggle room at all. You know, every stitch has to be in exactly the right place. So the only way you can alter the size is by altering your gauge with your yarn and your needle size. So I would say before starting, knit, cast on and test knit the number of stitches around the cuff if you want them for a particular person.
Thank you.
We have a question about the initials. Were people typically putting initials for the maker or the person giving them? And then to add on to this, what order would they put the initials in? Is it first name, last name, middle name, or first, middle, last?
Oh, right. Yes, it's the initial of the person who owned the gloves. So we think the initial, which is unlike that. There was something about the initials in the sweaters, wasn't there? Where I think an initial of a place is added on as well. It's the initials of the person who owned them. So I think again that is an indication of how special they were. And if you went to the trouble of getting somebody to make them for you, then you wanted to say, these are my gloves. So, hands off sort of thing.
Thank you.
Did the early Yorkshire glove knitters spin their own yarns?
No, I don't think they did. They were, they would be able to get factory spun yarn. And in fact, Mary Allen, the knitter who I believe knitted the most of them, knitted a couple of pairs in artificial silk or rayon, because she was knitting in the early 20th century when that was coming in as a yarn. And so for a lady's, for example, in the museum, there's a pair that were knitted for the vicar of the town, small town, a pair that were knitted for his wife, both in wool, and then she knitted another pair for the wife in artificial silk. So that would have been available to buy.
Wonderful. And I think we talked a little bit about this in our practice yesterday, but can you explain more about where they would put the location of the initials or any symbols on the glove?
Well, the standard UK ones, it's round the cuff, above the two-color rib, and then above that. But if you look at the two historical ones with mittens with initials on, then the pair that I believe are from the UK, they're actually on the palm, which is really quite interesting because when you're wearing them, that would be hidden. I mean, it's a bit like, I guess, the fashion's gone for putting children's names on garments. So you'd be able to, they were yours, but you wouldn't be advertising it on the back. On the other hand, on the old liturgical gloves, any identifier and Christ's initials were on the back so that they would be seen during the service. So it varies. I mean, the pair from the Netherlands, there, I think the initials on, I can't even quite remember where they are. They're not round the cuff anyway. So it just varies.
Wonderful.
Angharad, are you very familiar with any of the United States museums, especially in communities that were settled by immigrants from Scotland or England? Are there any of these kinds of knitting patterns that have been found in the United States?
Well, not that I've found, but collections aren't always. I think there is a pair, and I'm desperately trying to remember where. I think possibly in Canada. Now and again, I get emails from people saying, "Oh, I've knitted these, or I've found these," and I think I did get something from Canada some while ago. But no, that's another good reason for coming over, isn't it? And having a dig around.
When you were talking about the Latvian gloves, you mentioned a book. Do you remember the name of that?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I can pull it off my shelf. This is the Rukava gloves. It's gloves and mittens actually. So that's, but the famous Latvian book is the Latvian Mitts by Grossman. So yeah, and actually, I did write an article about Latvian mitts. Do you know Selvage magazine? Last autumn. So I strayed from the glove path, went on to mitts.
There was a question about peasant thumbs. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. So the easiest way to make a thumb in a mitten or glove is to knit. Well, you can knit the whole thing and not even, and just ignore the thumb, or you can knit as far as the thumb, and then instead of allowing for the fact that the thumb is at the side, you place the opening for the thumb there, and you knit just enough stitches on spare yarn to then come back over those stitches in your real yarn, and you carry on knitting. And then when you have finished the mitten or glove, you come back to your spare yarn, and you can use this for heels as well and pockets, and you unpick that length of spare yarn, which you've sensibly done in a really bright contrasty color, in a yarn that will pull out of the stitches, and you get your needles and you pick each stitch up, usually with 2 needles. It's a little bit awkward, and then you start to knit, and that gives you your thumb. So you haven't got any shaping to think about, whereas in a more sophisticated glove pattern, to allow for the thumb, you've got to increase, and that can be done in various different ways. But with a peasant thumb, you don't have to. And you find it's very handy, especially if you've got a lot of patterning going on, because you haven't got to make any allowances for that patterning at the time.
Thank you.
While we're talking about construction, you talked a little bit about diamonds versus squares. Is there a structural reason for that? Does the fabric lay flatter or more even when blocking for diamonds?
Yes, yeah, it's quite interesting. Because I started designing gloves and playing around with these simple alternate stitches, in a checkerboard, or keeping them the same and doing vertical stripes. And they're really quite tricky to keep even vertical stripes. You'll get one stitch popping out above the other. And the same is true. And so you don't find that many patterns with vertical stripes in. Some, but not lots. And when you knit those little squares, you can almost see it happening in the pair that I've got now at home. They will tend to just pop out a little bit because you've got the tension on the two colors at the same place. If you did it all the way up and pulled it tight, you get that thing. Do you have tea cozies like this, where you actually get the knitting actually pops out because you pull it tight, it goes upwards? So I think when I first started playing around with knitting vertical and straight edges, I had a bit of an aha moment and thought, this is why so many knitting patterns default to a diagonal, because it's very easy to follow and your knitting just lies flatter. That's my theory anyway.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Maddie, could you pull up the slides one last time?
Yes.
And this is about the last pair of gloves that you showed, the sort of mystery gloves that you were able to locate. And it's about the floral design on the cuff. And so the question is, do you see many of these floral type designs in stranded gloves?
Well, no, not in the UK. It's generally geometric patterns or a two-color cuff in that position. The one pair that are similar in that respect is a pair that were knitted, that are in the collection of Leicester museums, that were knitted for somebody called he's one of Lord Howick, and his other name was Earl Grey, as in the tea. And he has a pair of gloves that have all sorts of they're cream with pink and blue and green on, and they're very much like sampler patterns, embroidery patterns, very similar to these, which are almost like a little plant, aren't they? They're not quite a person, but they're more like a little tree or a plant. And they're pretty unusual. The Lord Howick gloves, I'm not sure if there's a picture on the internet, but there is a picture in my book, because I just think they're really interesting. And as ever, nothing is known about them, like who knitted them and why and where did they get the patterns from. But they did put the date and his name round the cuff, so that's a help.
Well, this isn't a very good option, but I'll hold that up to the screen for you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah. Do you see? I think they're quite similar, those little tree type patterns. Thank you, Lorraine. That's great.
Of course. Thank you.